Right.
Awesome. Hey, I would like to introduce Stephanie Kerst with Sage Living. I just had an opportunity to meet Stephanie about 2 weeks ago, I think. And I was so impressed with chatting with her that one of the first things out of my mouth was, we've got to get a conversation recorded so that I can share your information with the public. So welcome, Stephanie. Thank you for joining me this morning.
Thank you, Linda. It's good to be here.
Oh, thank you. Now, why don't you tell people what kind of consultant you are?
Absolutely. So I'm a building biologist. I am a certified electromagnetic radiation specialist. And what does that mean? What's a building biologist? Because most people don't know. And the answer is someone who comes in and helps make your home or your potential home a cleaner place. And as we think about that, there's a myriad of ways that that could be done. Some building biologists look at water quality, indoor air quality. Some look at mold and mold remediation. My specialty is electromagnetic radiation. And what that means, there are a bunch of different kinds of EMF. You'll hear me refer to it as EMR or EMF, electromagnetic fields or electromagnetic radiation. There are a bunch of different kinds of EMF, and the one people are often most familiar with is wireless radiation, what's emitted by our cell phones and cell towers. But there are a few other sources, and there are a couple of sources in particular that we really want to consider when we look at real estate transactions.
That's so interesting. Now, I brought you in for my clients because we were looking at a house that was right next door to a high tension power line. And we were curious and concerned about the EMFs that might be emitted from it. We had gotten our iPhones and we found an app where we could go outside and measure the EMFs. And we thought we were being all smart, but we wanted to be still cautious. And lo and behold, you come out and it's like, oh, we're learning a whole new thing that none of us expected. And we had, engineers in the group. So I was very intrigued after meeting you. Talk a little bit about the high tension line transmissions versus the wireless transmissions.
Absolutely. So often I'm hired by a would-be buyer or their real estate representative. And it's usually because there's a concern on the property and they want to understand the impact of it, before going into escrow or before a contract closes. So in this case, Linda reached out on behalf of her clients and said, Stephanie, there's a set of high voltage transmission lines. Those are long distance power lines, the big metal towers that are right adjacent to the property. What might the impact be on the living spaces? Is this something that we should be concerned about? And so I'm hired, I come out, I have a professional grade kit of meters to measure all the EMFs. And after going
iPhone won't do it. That's not the right thing to use.
The iPhone won't do it. They won't do it. And even, there are inexpensive meters that can be purchased off of Amazon. I like to think of them as maybe an indicator, right? Maybe what you're seeing, but it may not have the degree of sensitivity and accuracy that we're looking for. And here's a funny one for you. Say you're using the EMF measuring app on your phone, but your phone, ironically, is one of the highest sources of radio frequency radiation, also called wireless radiation. So if you're walking around trying to measure the EMF from the cell tower with the app on your phone with your phone on, do you think the readings are going to be accurate?
Yeah, I know. We were all having to turn off our phones and to make sure that we were getting accurate readings. So it was definitely an eye opener.
And, I think what was interesting in this particular case was, I'll get the address, from you in this case, and I look it up ahead of time and try to get a sense of the neighborhood and if I've been there before and what I might see, and again, we're really looking for the big external sources of EMF that we have less control over. So think about cell towers, cell antennas, or power lines, whether they're these long distance high voltage transmission lines, the big metal towers, yeah, or even if they're the standard distribution lines, the brown utility poles that carry the electricity in our neighborhood. those in close proximity to a house can also have high readings. But this particular property was unique because I pulled up and immediately I saw the high voltage transmission lines that Linda had mentioned. And lo and behold, there were cell antennas all over that transmission tower. So the interesting thing is the wireless communications carriers, say Verizon or AT&T, right, as an example, had leased these transmission towers from PG&E to be able to use them as a cell tower, if you will. And I'll let Linda, give the lead into what it was that we ended up discovering. But I pull up and immediately I think, okay, there's two things happening here. One, potential elevated readings from the power lines, the high voltage transmission lines. But oh, look, what is the radio frequency radiation emissions from the cell antennas? That's got to be measured too. So right away, we have both big external sources, and we need to understand the impact on the living spaces.
Well, and since Stephanie teases, I will say that we were all surprised that, at the end of the day, it was not the emissions in this specific case from the high tension power lines that was the concern. Those were actually well within guidelines. And the guidelines, FYI, are different for what Stephanie is working with versus what the federal government is suggesting is safe. But the high tension lines were all fine. It was the emissions coming off the wireless cell carriers that were literally off the charts. I think it was 15 times higher than what was the top range that you would recommend. And
absolutely,
it was, the clients and I were all blown away by, because we never thought about this. We all live with cell phones and everything else. And it was like, wow. And so it was just such an eye-opening experience. And then when you started to go into, creating safe environments and safe spaces and how you can, mediate some things and other things you can't. And let's kind of talk a little bit about that.
Sure. And just real quick to touch on the guidelines, I refer to the building biology guidelines. They're for sleeping areas. They're incredibly strict, meaning the target levels for radiation exposure are very, very low. But that's really our goal, because if you think that we spend 30% of our lives sleeping, we really want to target our sleeping areas and get those numbers as low as possible. And so it's important to understand here that the baseline levels in this home, there was no other radio frequency radiation sources, no other wireless sources on in this home. No. There was no Wi-Fi. It was a vacant home. And so really all that's left is what's coming in from outside. Also, the meters have an audio signal. So I can tell pretty distinctly, are the readings coming from the cell tower or are they coming from Wi-Fi, even neighbors' Wi-Fi sometimes. Right. And in this case, it was very clear that we were in a vacant home and the predominant emissions were coming from the cell tower. And here's the thing, this is the lowest, the readings will fluctuate, right? We were there at one point in time, and that's a really important distinction. So if I came back, next week, maybe the readings are a little higher, maybe they're a little bit lower, right? They're always going to fluctuate. And that's a really important point to make. But the challenge is, say that the readings that we took the other day are pretty consistent. Say they're within 10 or 20% of what they might be for the rest of the year. The challenge is that ambient level in the house is just so much higher than what it could be. I would say, based on those readings, based on what I see in the Bay Area and across the country, the emissions in that home from the cell tower put the home probably in the top 5% of highest emitting homes that I've personally measured, and wow. I've been all over the Bay Area. So, it's important to take the data, perform a risk analysis and say, listen, here's where the numbers fall based on the building biology guidelines. And then, ideally present options for mitigation. But the challenge is, is that some sources of EMF are really hard to mitigate, right? And especially these external sources, these two that we've been talking about, which are the most important for when you're house hunting. External power line EMF and cell tower EMF, just to summarize it in a neat nutshell. Because they're such a large source, they're not easily shielded, if at all. And here's the thing, if we were to drive a half mile down the street, or a mile down the street, often in the suburbs, like in this area where we were, assuming there are no power lines and cell towers, right next door, you can read as low as, 10 to 20 microwatts per square meter in a suburban environment when you don't have those large external sources. And I'd much rather start you off moving into a new home from a health perspective at 10 to 20 microwatts per square meter versus, I believe it was 15 or 20,000 that measured in the primary bedroom. And that's before the family moved in and brought all of their wireless devices with them. So the point is, it's so good to have the data and to have the information and to have the context of, how low could it be? Or, is this a high reading? And that's where I can come in and advise just based on, professional experience.
Well, and one of the things that you talked about was the fact that that distance does help to lower those readings. So the house that's one house away will be a little bit lower and so on and so forth. And you also made a point of saying that just because you see something does not mean that it's not necessarily going to be bad. And I think that was a really important message, because you can't just like I said, because if it had only been just the high tension power lines without any wireless readings, we were fine. We were like, okay, this is good. We can move forward. Well, no, we can't move forward. It's the wireless now. That I thought was very informational.
And it's often, we can't make assumptions, right? And it's something that I remind myself of every day working with clients. All we can say is that each home is really unique, and we have to have the data, right? I can give you a general tip for, house hunting. Often, and we're talking specifically related to wireless radiation. So think about cell towers, airport radar, for example, also falls under this umbrella. But if you are in a home at the top of a hill or up on a ridge with gorgeous views, often in the Bay Area, you're going to have higher levels of radio frequency radiation. Just even if it's distant cell towers, even if it's airport radar that can travel up to 30 miles. So again, I try not to generalize, but topography can make a difference when it comes to wireless radiation exposure. So sometimes you might want to think about a house at the bottom of a hill or in a valley or in a heavily forested area. If there are lots of trees, it will also cut down the emissions. So there are some tips related to topography, but you're absolutely right. At the end of the day, every home just needs to be measured. And, the important thing that we're looking to do here is measure, capture the information and analyze it. And then we think about distancing. Distance is always your friend when it comes to EMF, source removal where we can. Often we can do that with smaller internal sources like a Wi-Fi router. I'd rather have it out of your home office, away from your feet. Best practices when it comes to cell phones. Would you like me to touch on a few of those?
Well, let me tell you, my whole sleeping pattern has changed thanks to you. I keep my iPad next to me. My phone's always down in the kitchen, long ways away. My iPad, I'd always would read or do whatever. And I've now really become good friends with turning off all of the Bluetooth and wireless and putting it in airplane mode. So I really tried to listen to you. So yeah, touch on it a little bit more.
I think that's so wonderful to hear, and again, I'm not anti-technology. I have a cell phone, but I'd like to think about us shifting our perspective to use the technology as we need it and put it away when we don't. Remember, distancing helps with EMF. So if you can create a central charging station for your phones and wireless devices in the kitchen or in the dining room, if you can take it off of your nightstand when it's on, and just give yourself some distance from it, it's going to go a long way. We've been talking about these big sources of EMF like power lines and cell towers, but interestingly, one of the highest sources of radio frequency emissions, again, wireless emissions, are from our cell phones. And we keep those in our pocket, on our body. We hold them to our head, we hold them in our hands, and it's ubiquitous, right? Almost everyone I know uses a cell phone. And so
they're attached to our bodies practically.
They're attached to our bodies. And again, I'm not going to sit here and say, hey, let's throw our cell phones out, because it's not realistic for 99% of the population.
No.
So let's talk about the best practices for cell phone use. So I want you to think about not holding it to your head, if ever. Let's think about texting, using speakerphone, using a wired headset. So not AirPods, again, because those are a wireless source. Any kind of wireless headphones, is simply keeping it right there at your head, if you will. What else? Putting it in airplane mode and double checking that Wi-Fi and Bluetooth are off. If you're going to use your cell phone as an alarm and it's going to be on your nightstand, the alarm will still work and you won't have the emissions.
Well, or download the book if you want to read your book on your device. Download the book and then turn off all the other bells.
Absolutely. And for people who are really curious, there is a consumer-friendly, wireless meter that I often recommend, for clients and for people who are interested. And, don't take it from me. You can measure it, yourself and just get a sense of what might be in your environment. Of course, you need a professional, ideally, to be able to evaluate what you're seeing. But it is interesting, because this radiation is invisible. We can't see it, we can't hear it, we can't smell it. And so how do we share this information with others and give them those tips that they can do to really lower their exposure?
What's kind of funny that as a realtor, it would be a bad thing if I say, oh, this house doesn't have good cell coverage, because everybody's listening to their phones. But from a health standpoint, that's almost a good thing if you have bad cell coverage, I would think.
Absolutely. And in my profession, that's a good thing. And the other interesting thing is, if you said, well, Stephanie, why should I turn off my Wi-Fi at night or put it on a timer to reduce the exposure in my home when I turn on my cell phone and I connect to Wi-Fi and I see 12 different networks? And this is a really important tip for people. It only takes, our cell phones are so finely calibrated, it only takes a fraction of a microwatt for that phone to search and detect, your neighbor's wireless network. But what matters is the strength of the emissions in your home, in your bedroom, where it matters, right? And so I guarantee you that 9 times out of 10, it's your own sources in your own home that are often stronger, than what you might pick up when you turn on Wi-Fi on your phone and see a bunch of different networks. And that's a really important point to make. Remember, if distance is your friend, let's think about the sources within your own home and do what we can to minimize those. Because here's why this matters. I have clients on a daily basis who make small incremental lifestyle changes, right? Better habits with a cell phone, turning the Wi-Fi off at night, putting the Wi-Fi on a timer so that it's off when they're sleeping, whatever your schedule might be. And they feel better. They sleep better. They have less brain fog. They have better ability to concentrate. Tinnitus, ringing in the ears, is another common symptom. So, the research shows that we're all affected on a cellular level. Some of us just become symptomatic a little bit, sooner than others. And I would say about half of my clients are simply wellness minded, right? They just are precautionary and they take their health seriously and they want to minimize exposure to environmental toxins. EMF is just one, right? There are many. And the other half of my clients are symptomatic, some so much that they can't hold a cell phone. And so what I tell people is, hey, let's get these good practices as part of your regular lifestyle, so that you don't have, an episode where you do become, overly sensitized and much more sensitive, because it's a much harder place to live, right? When you can't go to the grocery store because you can't tolerate everyone else's cell phones walking around. So
wow.
Anyway, yeah. And, that's a very small percentage of the population, but it is very real for those people. So, and that's new for most of us.
Wow. I always tell people that you don't know what you don't know. And clearly we are just starting to scratch the surface and get this information out. Stephanie, I thank you so much for sharing. I mean, I know that we just scratched the surface here on your expertise. And so we are going to include all of your information at the end of this video so people can reach out to you or, you know, and get information from you, because I think it's valuable information. And I truly thank you for sharing with us all that you have. I think this is important to get out there for people to know what's going on from a health standpoint. You know, when I sell a house, I want to make sure that it's going to be the right house for the client on all levels. And, you know, I've been in the business for 20 years now, and you've just taught me a lot of information, a lot of things to think about. So thank you very much.
It's my pleasure. You're really at the forefront of an emerging health topic. And I think that that's highly important that, you know, you have this knowledge and you have it, and it's a service that you can provide to your clients that really puts you at the top of your field. So thank you for your time today.
Awesome. Thank you so much.